Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Lotus Yu, and I am a Senior Manager of Engagement and Partnerships here at the Full Frame Initiative. Thanks for joining us to talk about this procurement toolkit and walk through it. I will be your guide today, going through this toolkit and showing you the various highlights that are in there. A little housekeeping. Feel free to drop comments in the chat and put questions in the Q&A section. Even though a lot of this is me sharing information about what's in the toolkit, we have reserved some time at the end to answer some of your questions. And of course, you can feel free to get in touch after the webinar as well. There is closed captioning, so you can enable it in the options below. If you run into any issues tech-wise or anything, feel free to contact Sasha Green-Atchley in the chat, and she can help you out. Before jumping in, I would love to get a sense of who's in the room. Of course, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Also, I am curious to learn from you about what field you're in and whether you issue RFRs or RFPs or both. So I'm going to launch a poll and see who's here. All right. It looks like poll responses have slowed down. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. It looks like most of us with human services, which makes a lot of sense since this toolkit was written for human services. And it also looks like there are folks from a few other fields as well. You may know, if you watch the short video on the website, that a lot of the concepts in this toolkit are applicable to other fields. A lot of the examples I'll use today are human services specific. So you may need to plug in your own examples, although definitely some of the concepts will be relevant for your work as well. And it looks like we have a mix of folks who issue RFRs, RFPs, and respond to them. So great to see a diversity of perspectives in the room coming to this webinar. Thank you for being here. So to tell you a little bit about the Full Frame Initiative, we are a national social change organization, and our North Star is a country where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. But there is not a fair shot right now in the world today. And you can see it everywhere. You can see it in the research. You can see it in newspaper headlines. There are disparities in every corner. And the reason we don't have a fair shot is because of all the oppressions that are built into our systems. These systems that we're in force unsustainable trade-offs for people in the name of progress. And so when I say unsustainable trade-offs, what I mean is in order for people to get a benefit, the way our systems are set up, it requires people to expend a great cost in well-being. So an example of this is someone who is required to go into an appointment because in order to get a benefit, but that this appointment maybe conflicts with their child's basketball practice, which means that that child can no longer go and can no longer be on the team. So that's a cost. That's a cost to well-being, a cost to their relationships. And so these kinds of trade-offs are built into the system, these requirements, these structures. And a lot of times that burden falls disproportionately along the lines of race, gender, religion, and other identities. And it just widens the gap of who has a fair shot at well-being. And it just digs it deeper and deeper. So procurement processes have a really important role to play in shifting these systems. And I'd like to get a sense from you all in the room, what you already think about when you think about procurement processes and procurement. There is You can feel free to scan with your phone if you really want to. You can also, I'm also going to drop into the chat a link to this Mentimeter. So we can create a word cloud together of these different concepts that we have. See it, intimidating, complex, difficult, bureaucratic. There's money, there's transparency, fairness. Yep. Out of date, rubric, designing at the margins, rules, inflexible, cumbersome. Yeah, so it seems like there's a range of what feels like is part of procurement processes. On the one hand, it brings some structure and brings things, it makes things transparent. And on the other hand, there are also all these pieces that are confusing and tedious and complex. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I want to share with you also a different set of words. And these are a set of words that have to do with a procurement that is centered on well-being. And I had asked a few colleagues about what are some words and that come to mind when you think about an equitable access to well-being as a design principle. And these are some words that came to mind for them. And so these are some of them are very overlapped with what there is now. And so there's not, it doesn't mean we throw everything out the door, definitely keeping some of what's there and also adjusting other pieces. And there may be other words too, but just a few things that came to mind. And so why is procurement important? Why is procurement an important lever for change? One of those reasons is because procurement can drive practices and shift narratives. It tells us what's valued in our communities or what's valued through the procurement process. Are we counting people served? Are we counting shelter beds? Or are we valuing the increases in well-being that people experience? Or doing both, right? But that affects our mindsets. What is most valued and what is at the center can impact how programs are designed, how those structures are built, how the processes run. And so it can affect it on that level. Procurement also affects the stories that are told, particularly about the people who come in and seek services. So are we focusing on the individual? And so in this image, like, are we focusing on what makes somebody a really good swimmer or not great? Are we putting all that burden on the individual doing it all, them doing it for themselves? Or do we tell the larger story about how this person is living within a context that puts a disproportionate burden on them? So are we using that systems lens to really tell the fuller story of what is resulting in some of what we see? And those narratives also affect then how programs are built, how structures happen in our country. And so this toolkit is based on a very specific definition of well-being and is really trying to influence along those two lines around what's valued and expressing what's valued and also what the stories are that are told. So I'm going to share with you a short video that talks a little bit about this particular definition of well-being, since this is a definition that is really embedded inside of the toolkit. The set of needs and experiences universally required to weather challenges and have health and hope. I'm going to play a short 4-minute video with our Chief of National Engagement and Partnerships, Tanya Tucker, speaking on a different webinar. So if you are, I get a kick out of thinking about you all watching a webinar clip inside a webinar. So if you also get a kick out of that too, I thought I'd say that out loud. So here is the video.
We see well-being as the set of needs and experiences universally required in combination and balance to weather challenges and to have health and hope. And so, well-being is something that is a universal drive for all of us. We are all hardwired for well-being. We do not see it as a drive. It's a drive, not a destination. It's not something that we do or have. It's actually fundamentally how we live our lives. And so, to actually foster long term well being, it requires that we build on assets, that we minimize trade offs among this set of needs and experiences. And we call those the 5 domains of well being. And we need to do that at the individual level, family, community, institutional, and system level. So, what are these 5 domains? Social connectedness. We all need to feel like we belong. We are individually and collectively healthier, we're more resilient, more productive, more mutual when we feel that we belong and that we have people we can depend on, and there are people who depend on us. We also need to experience some sense of predictability in our lives so that we're not only able to just focus on the here and now, but that we can also focus on the future and growth and change. Safety. We need to be able to express core parts of ourselves without fear of physical or emotional harm. And this isn't just about people and places, but systems and programs can make someone feel unsafe or a sense of safety. Mastery, we all need to have some influence over actually what's happening around us and to experience purpose and growth. So, this isn't about actually mastering something or being an expert in something, but it's seeing the correlation of your effort and outcomes. It's having some control and choice about what's around you and meaningful access to relevant resources. We all need to meet our needs for food, for shelter, and other basics without shame or danger and in ways that are actually relevant to our situations. So, well being, this isn't a framework for here's what well being should look like for people living in poverty or for kids in the foster care system or people with addiction. This is actually a framework for all of us. We are all trying to meet our needs for well being every day. One of the domains isn't more important than the other. There's no hierarchy here. They work together, and we may be focused on, one domain more than the other at a given time, but one's not more important. And while they're definitely universally needed, they're actually very individually experienced. So access to these domains is important. context matters, history matters. And the other point that I'll raise is that we actually all have assets in each area, in each one of these domains. We all have assets and we all have challenges.
Sorry about that. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the framework that this toolkit is based on. It's an evidence-informed framework that is really around understanding how we are as human beings. And when we understand that this is how our brains are hardwired, this is how we're set up to live, that we're always trying to strive towards these 5 domains of well-being in order to move towards increased well-being, then all kinds of things become possible. When we work in this way, it's more possible to have durable change, right? We talked about how our systems widen the gap. A lot of people find themselves going in and out of systems, and each time with each go around, they're worse off. And because of what's already in our systems around racial and other disproportionalities, that dynamic just keeps digging inequities even deeper. And so when we understand how people's are set up, we understand people's experience and within the context that they live in, we can actually help to make change that increases equity. It also becomes possible to work with community. When we understand well-being in this way and understand that people are affected by the design of systems and it results in trade-offs in these domains, we have no choice but to involve people in the design of systems, because people know best what it is that will affect them, what will affect their domains of well-being, and how to fix it, how to move forward. Also, well-being orientation is all about trying to help people thrive in communities. So how can we provide support to those how can we support those informal supports that exist in community, like recognizing and leveraging the church support that churches provide, or supporting informal childcare systems, rather than trying to replace both of those things with formal services all the time. Most of us send our kids to a friend or family member when we need extra help. How do we help people in our systems to have the same privilege to do so? What also becomes possible with well-being is that this brings a unified lens. It brings a way of working across issue areas and integrating multiple frameworks. I assume many of you, either yourself or working with other organizations that have lots of models and frameworks. And I think about this well-being concept as something that knits all those frameworks together and provides a common language. And it's more than just the coordination of services, right? People don't all live their lives in services, nor should they, right? And so looking at the way that people are living their lives in the whole and in the context means recognizing the informal support and community resources that are not part of traditional services. And it means that because everyone will be aligned around well-being rather than individual agency priorities, then people who are in those multiple systems will feel less of that push and pull, because everyone is working in concert with each other, and there will be fewer trade-offs for some people. So that's kind of where we're wanting to head with the toolkit, or where the toolkit is trying to take us. And so this toolkit harnesses the power of using well-being as a design principle, primarily as it applies to human services. But as I mentioned before, a lot of these concepts are applicable to other fields, and other fields have found it useful too. It represents the collective learnings from our work with partners in trying to create procurements in this way. It is also intended to be a companion to what else you use around procurement. Each place has its own context. It can be used with other guidance around equity and contracting, such as those supporting BIPOC or women-owned businesses, for example. So it's not necessarily a standalone, and at the same time, you don't have to take it entirely as a whole, right? This is focused on well-being. It's a take as what works for you scenario. You don't have to use it in its entirety. Just take the pieces that work for you. I'm going to walk us through 6 principles in the toolkit that are primarily around the kinds of services to purchase for, what to look for in order to support, and also share some of the other guidance in the toolkit around how to set up the procurement processes and give you a glimpse of what's in the appendix and some other handouts that are in the toolkit itself. And in the end, I will invite you to some steps you can take. So these are the 6 principles. Again, like I said, they are about helping you figure out what kinds of services to procure for, who to be procuring services for, organizations and programs that are operating in this way, aligned with this way of thinking of well-being, may not be using this language. Right? The language is not important. The concepts are. They may be doing what they are. They may be furthering the efforts towards equitable access to well-being without saying that. And so these principles are intended to help you figure out who's doing that so that we can support those organizations that are supporting equitable access to well-being. The first principle is start with well-being. I think about this as seeing the full picture, understanding the whole person. And when we do that, it means that we are wanting programs that are screening in and not screening out. And this is because when we set up systems that screen out people, we could put people in situations where it makes sense to hide information that would disqualify you from a particular benefit. And that becomes problematic because then we don't have the whole picture. We don't know all the things that are happening, and we don't know what the major trade-offs are that this person might be weighing in their lives. And so when we're looking at starting with well-being, we create eligibility criteria that screen in. And we'll want to fund programs that have assessment around well-being, looking at that whole picture. When we see the whole person, we also acknowledge people's relationships, participants' relationships, even if they're imperfect. And that's also true for staff and board, allowing people to bring even staff, their own social networks into the work as well as building new ones. And so for each of these principles, there's also some guidance in the toolkit around what this means for procuring agencies. What should we expect or allow procuring agencies to do, or expect or allow bidders to do? So, for example, we want to use funding to support people's social networks. So if someone needs housing, for example, and their sister could take them in, but the one thing standing in their way is that their sister can't afford to pay for another person's use of utilities or food. How can we allow for funding to be used to pay that sister so that this person can stay with them? So thinking about creative ways of supporting that social network so that people can continue to live in community and continue to be out and thriving in community. We might expect bidders to support expanding social networks and not necessarily related to the issue area. So all of us, myself included, want relationships that are not just around what I'm struggling with or what I'm working on. We might want relationships that have to do with interest area. And so how do we help people support expanding social networks that are also around that? Which could be, maybe we help people get into a yoga community if that is what it is that they want and we're interested in, or something that they're interested around in film, a way to connect around interest area and supporting that as well. And it doesn't mean always, and it doesn't mean we don't, help, but it means that we do think about how we might consider expanding social networks outside of that too. For each of these principles, there are questions that are suggested in the toolkit to help that you can pose to bidders to find out more about how they're operating, whether or not they're aligned with these principles. So there's formal language options and plain language options. I know the text is probably too small on your screen to read, but so we won't go into them in detail, but they are all in the toolkit for you to look at. There's also guidance around scoring applicant responses. So what is being looked for and what is not being looked for. So we're not going to go through all those today, but to know that they're there and all there in the toolkit for you to look at. Second principle is around designing with and not for, and this is all about power shifting. Communities that are less wealthy and less white have had power shifted out of their communities systematically and increasingly handed over to public systems. And so this is about reshifting all of that power, which is, yes, inherently an important thing. And also programs are better and more effective when people are involved, and when people are involved in the impacts that impacts them. So in that scenario, staff facilitate co-assessments. So rather than assessing someone and having assessment be something that is done to someone, staff are facilitating people through an assessment process so they can assess themselves. In terms of the program, participants are there to have value and voice, and also be able to bring their expertise to the table. Staffing also reflects the community of the program so that that perspective is at the table of the design. This is just a little video, so more than just a survey or focus group, bringing people to the decision-making table. You may have seen that already if you watched the short video. So what does this mean for procuring agencies? It means that we need to allow funding to be used creatively and flexibly. So for that example earlier on around somebody having to miss basketball practice because their parent needs to go to a really important appointment, how can we allow bidders or allow funding to be used to pay to transport that child to basketball practice instead of trying to making this person miss that practice? How can we use funding to support participants in working towards goals that are not directly related to an issue area? So for example, if someone in a domestic violence program wants to get a GED, how can we support them in that? We know from our project in California, which I'll drop into the chat link right now. This project tells us that when we have a sense of mastery in one area of our life, it can affect change in another part of our lives. And so if we think about supporting well-being overall, that can really increase whatever area that you are working on with somebody. And if we believe that people are important in bringing expertise to the table, how can we allow for funding to compensate community members for their expertise? They're bringing something valuable. Let's compensate them. Principle 3 is leveraging community assets, not just programs. So people live and thrive in communities, which is not to say that programs aren't important at all, but how can we expand and also think about how do we build those communities up to for people to thrive in and not replace what's already there? And so what does that mean for procuring agencies? How can we pay for staff to cultivate relationships with community assets? And you might be wondering, why is there a picture of a grandma on here? I was in a breakout room a little while back where someone was sharing that in the community that they're with, it was the grandma who was there, who knew everybody, knew what was going on, connected people to each other. And so how can we spend funding to support staff in developing relationships with that person, with the people who are the cornerstone of the community? And how can we have funding available to support the informal economy? In every community, there are assets. There are informal assets, such as where a church where people get food, they get mental health care. There is maybe a hardware store or a mechanic shop that gives people second chance jobs. Maybe there's a neighbor who's running a meal service. How can we not replace them? How can we support them? Is there anything we can do to pay for the certification of informal daycare to make it more possible? Right? How can we build those communities up to thrive? And so, relatedly, we might want to expect that bidders would submit letters of support from informal or non-traditional partners, such as churches, libraries, barbershops, and places like that. Principle 4 is about supporting people and getting what they need and want, not just helping them manage what they don't have. The way our systems are set up, they're built around an assumption that people in poverty can't manage money, which is not true, because a lot of people in poverty can manage money better than I can and know how to stretch a dollar better than I can. The problem is that there isn't money. And yet we have created these systems that require us to work around things, and we can get people some things, which makes things better, but it might not be exactly what they need and want. And so how can we require flex funds to be available, to be used for people with whatever comes up? So a couple examples of this. I was talking with a partner who shared with me that she knew somebody who had a state issued cell phone with limited minutes. This person was issued the cell phone so that they could set up a housing appointment. And time again, that housing appointment wasn't set up. And it turned out that the reason for that was because when this person called to set up a housing appointment, they were always on hold. And those hold minutes would run out, and that meant that this person didn't have time to call their mom. And so they decided they would rather call their mom. And so how do we put systems in place, or how do we allow funding in order to address trade-offs like that? How do we allow flex funds to pay for additional minutes, to pay for something until maybe a policy changes or some other structure changes? Another example is fixing car brakes or fixing a car to make it possible for people to make it to appointments, rather than trying to troubleshoot by having programs personally drive people to places. Would be better for the person and also better for the programs to have that be available. So what does this mean for what procuring agencies need to expect or allow bidders to do? One is paying for improvements to existing assets like cars and things like that. Again, working against the assumption that people in poverty can't manage money. So let's not create policies that overburden people so that they can get what they need without having to give up a whole lot of well-being in order to do it. Principle 5 is recognizing that systems are part of the problem. So funding organizations and programs that have an interest in actually fixing the systemic barriers and not just working around them, not fixing people, because it's the systems that are broken. It's those historical inequities that were built into the rules and policies that are built into the systems that are broken. So what does that mean for procuring agencies? It means looking and funding programs and organizations that have a priority of racial equity and social justice, because those who are taking this lens are going to recognize the systemic barriers and take those apart. It also means allowing and expecting bidders, applicants to describe issues through a systems lens and not a personal one. It means expecting them not to tell the story about how people are broken, but instead telling the story of how systems are broken and how they're going to be fixing it. Principle 6, expect learning and evolution. This is a new way of doing things, and it is going to involve innovation. So there needs to be space for innovating and a learning approach, space for people to support each other within a cohort. And that's on the program level. And also this is true, it's a mindset. Innovation is a mindset. So on more the individual level, there is an expectation, there should be expectation that service plans would also change as time goes on, right? So as we learn more, we evolve. What does this mean for bidders, for expectations for bidders? It means allowing for programs to change over time based on learnings. Just because that's what the application was when it was submitted may not mean at the end of the year or 2 years that this is still the exact same program. And so allowing for evolution. Prioritizing those bidders that have a track record of innovation, which even if it is unsuccessful, because innovation requires some degree of failure and learning from it. And when the status quo doesn't work and is harmful, there really is no other option than to innovate. And so how can we prioritize innovation, learning from innovation being an important piece of that? And so in that spirit, financially supporting a learning and innovation cohort, so that either led by the procuring agency or some other facilitator, so that organizations can learn from each other, and learn from what worked and didn't work. So that's a brief overview of the 6 principles in the toolkit that are designed to help with figuring out what organizations and what programs to fund. Like I said before, for each of those principles, there are questions in the toolkit that can be posed to potential applicants, potential bidders to reply to, as well as scoring guides for how to score those specific questions and what to be looking for and what not to be looking for. And all of those can be taken, tweaked, used however makes sense. And there are, I just pulled out a couple examples. There are a lot more examples about what this means for procuring agencies and what this means for procuring agencies to be paying attention to and allowing for. The toolkit also includes some guidance on procurement design and the process itself. So I'm going to highlight a few of them here. The first is, again, this is a new way of doing things. So what will happen oftentimes is that we will fall into the old pattern of ways. Even if the procuring agency wants to do things differently, people may be used to telling the same story of how people are broken and how the program has saved them, because that's what got funding before. And it will be really hard for people to make that shift. So we need to be able to impress on people that this is new, this is a brand new way of doing things, that you should be telling a different story or answering different questions. And so setting up that framing is really important up front. In the toolkit, there is an example. I know you can't read the text here, but we will leave you with the toolkit at the end of this webinar so you can flip around in there. There's an example in here from some of our work with the City of New London. We were working with them to distribute the Federal American Rescue Plan Act dollars in a way that is really innovative and different. And there is a blurb in there around how this was introduced as a new way of doing things, as an example. There's guidance in here around process and language to increase equity. And I'm a little bit curious from you all, because I think that some of this floats out there, which ones of these you have heard of, which ones of these you have done before. So I am going to launch this poll real quickly. Which of these strategies for increasing equity do you use or have you seen used before by either funders, procuring agencies that you've used yourselves or seen used by others? So it seems like voting has slowed down. I'm going to share these results for all of us to see. Looks like a lot of folks are already describing inequities through a systems lens, which is awesome. providing extensions for those affected by disasters, great. It seems like folks are doing that too. It's probably not a surprise to you that people most affected by natural disasters the impacts tend to be concentrated in communities of color and low income communities. And so when disaster hits, they are disproportionately affected and may not be able to communicate. So if there can be low barrier extensions, allowing people to be late if they can't communicate, that can really help to increase equity. Eliminating literature review and footnotes. Awesome. It looks like folks are starting to think about that. With academic research, it can be expensive to access journals, and also sometimes people's ability to execute a program or a contract doesn't necessarily have to do with their ability to do academic or summarize academic research in this particular manner. Use person first language, great. Yes, let's not other people, and allowing for communication between the procuring agency and the applicant. I think a lot of times in this, the communication tends to happen within formal grant writing workshops and things like that. And a lot of times that communication is limited because in the name of fairness, to try to keep things fair. And what actually ends up happening, as I suspect some of you already know, those who are doing some of this, is that for well-established organizations who have regularly been getting grants, they have what we call shadow technical assistants that basically they know who to call to help them in the grant writing process to understand the norms. But for those organizations that are doing really great community work who are not as well established or may not know what the norms are. So like, for example, if letters of support are required, organizations not so familiar with grant writing, they may not know what the norms are for getting those letters or which ones are likely to carry weight for which funders in what circumstances. And so that gives well-networked organizations an unfair advantage. And great plain language. Yes, it's great to see that folks are already using as much plain language as possible, not letting organizations be hampered by jargon, for sure. All right. So I'm gonna, these all came one at a time, but I decided just to talk to you about them through the poll. So the toolkit also offers guidance around data and payment expectations. I mean, like we had opened with, are we counting people served or shelter beds? How does that influence the way we set things up? This toolkit suggests that we focus on well-being, have pay for increased well-being and outcomes based on well-being, and also encourages us to be looking for specifically collecting data about trade-offs, even if it implicates the agency itself, right? So what are the barriers that we may not see that people are having to experience? An example of this is someone receiving an eviction notice for not paying because she couldn't afford the money order fee at the post office, right? We might not even notice that it's a barrier unless, how will we notice if it's a barrier unless we're collecting and deliberately collecting data on the trade-offs that people are experiencing and those barriers and what those impacts are. In terms of considering what proposals to fund, the toolkit offers some guidance, not comprehensive. There's obviously lots of other considerations. We talked about letters of support, also looking at arts and culture, which tends to be treated as an extra. But in many communities, it can be something to heal, something to connect people to, and can really help drive towards well-being. There are examples in the toolkit around building access to technology through digital art, how art can articulate assets and the strengths of a community. There are examples in there and links to all of those. We talked about jargon just a minute ago. A lot of times the documents that organizations have those, so allowing funds to revamp those documents. And a procurement process to change systems only works if we're funding also bidders who want to move systems. And so suggesting that bidders are selected who are interested in moving towards systems that support equitable access to well-being. The toolkit also has a lot of guidance on bidders, a new kind of bidders conference, and also how to review proposals. This is because people are going to fall into the patterns. And so there are links in there to some example materials. There is some guidance in here around a review process to work against bias that can be called upon too. So there is that in the toolkit as well. I am going to share right now the toolkit itself real quickly so I can show you what it looks like. So this is the toolkit. Some of you probably have already looked through it. There are links. It links to itself in lots of different places. There's a lot of stuff and resources too. In the appendix, there are a few things. One is I mentioned for each of those principles, there are questions. They are embedded in the principle section, but they're also all pulled out into the appendix. So you don't have to flip around. So all the questions that are in the toolkit are in this appendix, and it all links to each section, to each principle, for example. And then if you go down a little bit more, there is this little handout, which is just a 8.5 by 11 poster of the principles that you could put on a wall, have handy, anything like that. And like the questions for the scoring guide sections, rather than having to click everywhere or flip around, those are all pulled out into the appendix as well. So you have that all together, what we're looking for each of these principles. And the last piece of the appendix is this RFR process self-assessment. And this just walks through each part of the toolkit. Of course, you don't have to be doing everything in here, but it's a way to just check yourself and go through and just see which pieces you are doing as you're moving through building your procurement process. So let me flip back here to the screen. I will drop that into the chat in a minute towards the end. So ways that you can advance this work, share the toolkit widely or start a conversation, and send feedback. This is information that it comes from years of learning, but it hasn't been put into a toolkit in this way. And there is always more learning to be done, and would love to have other brains thinking together. And so send feedback. Let's put out something even better. Pick one element of the toolkit and commit to applying it. Try it out, see how it goes. And another way is to join a learning community of people committed to exploring this toolkit together. So you can fill out an information form to an interest form, which does not commit you to commit you to this learning community. But I think it will make sure that you are connected to the learning, to us, to give you information about the learning community. I'm going to find that form and drop that in the chat right here. Learning community interest form. Here you go. So if you are interested, you can scan obviously with your phone, but also you can click on this link and fill it out. We would love to see you as being part of this learning community to learn about this procurement toolkit together. So thank you for joining us for this webinar. The link to the toolkit itself is here. I will also stick that in the chat so that you have it. There you go. And so this is your tour of the Contracting for Transformation Toolkit. Again, my name is Lotus. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, any thoughts. Any feedback around that? And if there are questions, we have a few minutes for questions, so feel free to drop them in the Q&A section or into the chat. Thank you so much for being here. Well, if there are no other questions, I will play some outro music as folks drop off.
Lotus?
Yes.
Sorry, we have Joanne Russell raised her hand.
Oh, great. Hi, Joanne.
How is everybody? Season's greetings. This is very good information, Lotus. It reminded me of a meeting I was in yesterday with human services and especially mental health providers. And they were talking about some of the things you were talking about from the standpoint of evaluation and how when funders want to, how do you quantify certain things? Are you guys applying any of this to evaluation? I noticed you mentioned data. But yeah, how do you measure when a person's been in their counseling? How do you, all those human services touches that they're having challenges for qualifying for funding and then reporting back so that they look like they can see the volume of, and the caliber of work that they've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. Yes, evaluation is a really important piece of this, and I think there's a lot of connection between some of the data pieces in here and evaluation itself, because evaluation ultimately does tell us what we're valuing, right? It's even kind of in the evaluation word. It is what we're looking for, what we're counting, what we are measuring. And so then we end up designing programs and processes around that, whatever it is that ends up being picked out. And I think that is very relevant here. And yes, we do some work around trying to evaluate around well-being. How do you use this lens of increased well-being as progress, rather than just counting the people that are coming in? And also, how do we make sure that we are looking at the trade-offs that people are facing and trying to measure that? And so there's a lot of overlap here. I don't know if I answered your question, though. Did I answer your question, Joanne?
Yes, you did. And I'm going to share this with the cohort that I'm part of so that they can see it and their team leaders can actually get involved, because I'm in Los Angeles. So I had an introduction to the organization at a community meeting about a month ago. So yeah, we have a connection. It should be interesting because they sound like they would really love to contribute, like you said, and give input on how this is reflecting for them when it comes. So thank you very much. This was very good time spent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing it with that group, and would love to connect and find opportunities to talk about this. Any other questions out there? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'll play more of this song that I was playing at the beginning as you all drop off. Enjoy the rest of your day.